The conflict between the Angevins and the Normans had lasted for over a century, rooted in territorial struggles and power disputes. This age-old feud intensified when Matilda, daughter of King Henry I, sought to secure her position in the battle for the English crown. After the untimely death of Henry's son, Matilda was considered his rightful heir. To strengthen her claim, she aligned herself with Geoffrey Plantagenet, whose sprig of broom in his hair earned him the famous nickname Plantagenet. This small, seemingly insignificant gesture marked the beginning of a dynasty that would rule England for over 2 centuries. At the time, the ruling dynasty was still called the Anjou dynasty, after the French county of Anjou from which it had originated. The name Plantagenet would not be firmly established until the 15th century, when England, engaged in a bitter war with France, sought to distance itself from its Anjou origins. This heralded a new chapter in English history and signified a shift that would define future generations. Geoffrey Plantagenet's rise was driven by calculated political moves. Following Count Folk V of Anjou's journey to Jerusalem, where he became king, his son Geoffrey succeeded him as count in 1135. When Henry I died, Geoffrey's son, Henry, inherited his claim to the English throne. But the crown was seized by Henry's nephew, Stephen I, which plunged England into a civil war. Matilda's arrival in England in 1141 marked the beginning of one of the most tumultuous periods in English history. After her father, King Henry I, passed away in 1135, the crown was claimed by his nephew, Stephen I. Despite Henry having named Matilda as his successor, this caused a significant power struggle between the two, a conflict that would come to be known as the Anarchy. Matilda's claim to the throne was based on the fact that her father had chosen her as his heir after the death of her brother. However, Stephen, a man of considerable political skill and military support, seized the opportunity and declared himself king, leaving Matilda with little power. Yet, Matilda, determined to claim what was rightfully hers, did not give up easily. With her supporters, including her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, Matilda set sail to England in 1141, hoping to rally the support of the English barons and wrest control of the kingdom from Stephen. When Matilda and her forces landed in England, they were able to gain a significant advantage by capturing Stephen. Stephen was imprisoned, and for a brief period, it seemed that Matilda's victory was imminent. She assumed control of London and gained support from several barons who were dissatisfied with Stephen's reign. Matilda took the moment to declare herself the rightful ruler, assuming that her claims, supported by the imprisonment of Stephen, would solidify her reign. However, this victory was short-lived, as Matilda's triumph led to further divisions within her own ranks and ultimately weakened her position. One of the key challenges Matilda faced was her inability to secure the loyalty of the Londoners. While Matilda had captured the city, her rule was not fully accepted. She was seen as a foreign female ruler in a time when monarchy was almost exclusively a male domain. The citizens of London, already weary of instability, rose against her. They supported Stephen's cause and demanded her departure. With Stephen's forces in pursuit and the barons increasingly divided, Matilda's grip on power quickly began to unravel. The tide of the conflict shifted when Stephen managed to escape from captivity in 1142. He was freed by his supporters, and with renewed strength, he launched an offensive against Matilda. The war once again turned into a brutal back-and-forth affair with no decisive victory. By the following year, Matilda, her forces in retreat, narrowly escaped capture during a desperate escape from Oxford, where Stephen's troops had her surrounded. Matilda's troops suffered further setbacks, and by 1143, she controlled only a portion of the western part of England, while Stephen's forces held the remainder. The prolonged conflict between Matilda and Stephen became more than a simple dynastic struggle. It devolved into a chaotic civil war. The period became known as the Anarchy, an apt description of the disorder that had consumed the kingdom. With no clear victor, the power struggle weakened both sides. The barons, often shifting loyalties between the two claimants, further fractured the English nobility, and the constant war wreaked havoc on the country's economy and stability. The anarchy would go on for nearly 2 decades, with no end in sight. Meanwhile, on the continent, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey Plantagenet, was still fighting for his lands in France, but his political and military campaigns could not secure the throne for his wife in England. Geoffrey's victories in France, while important for his own legacy, had little impact on Matilda's struggle for the English crown. In fact, as the war dragged on, the support for Matilda began to diminish. While she had the loyalty of some powerful figures, including her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, others began to back away from her cause. By 1148, after years of failed attempts at consolidating power, Matilda abandoned her struggle for the English crown. She had failed to win the support of the crucial Londoners, and despite her earlier successes, her efforts had been undermined by internal divisions and the stubbornness of her opponents. Matilda retreated to Normandy, leaving England in the hands of Stephen. But despite her withdrawal, the war did not officially end. Stephen continued to reign as king, but the anarchy, as it would be remembered, had left an indelible mark on the English monarchy. Stephen's reign would continue for several more years, but the Civil War had caused irreparable damage to the English crown. The years of instability had exhausted both sides, and England was left divided. While Stephen held the throne, his legitimacy had been called into question, and his reign was plagued by constant rebellions and discontent from the barons. The barons, having seen how easily the throne could be contested, now felt empowered to act independently, and their actions would eventually lead to further instability. In 1153, after nearly 2 decades of warfare, Stephen and Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, reached an agreement known as the Treaty of Wallingford. The treaty established that, upon Stephen's death, the crown would pass to Henry, thus ending the conflict. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Plantagenets, who would ascend to the throne with Henry II. But the anarchy had left its scars on the English monarchy. The barons were more powerful than ever, and the kingdom had been irreparably weakened by years of division. Although Matilda never ruled England, her legacy lived on through her son, Henry II, who would become the first king of the Plantagenet Dynasty. His ascension to the throne would bring an end to the years of civil war. Hugh, and his reign would lay the foundations for one of the most powerful dynasties in English history. The Plantagenets would go on to rule England for over 300 years, but the anarchy and the war for the crown remain a bitter memory for the English people, shaping their political landscape for generations to come. The year 1154 marked a pivotal moment in English history as Henry Plantagenet, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet, ascended the throne as Henry II, the first king of the Plantagenet Dynasty. The Treaty of Wallingford, negotiated between Stephen I and Henry, had effectively sealed Henry's claim to the throne. The agreement ended a brutal civil war, known as the Anarchy, and ended the chaos that had gripped England for nearly 2 decades. With Stephen's death, Henry's reign began, and he would go on to become one of England's most powerful and consequential monarchs. At the time of Henry's ascension, his kingdom stretched from Scotland in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, encompassing vast territories that spanned both England and large parts of France. His lands were unrivaled in Europe, making him one of the most powerful rulers of his time. However, this power came with a significant dilemma. Was Henry primarily the King of England, with holdings in France, or was he a French vassal wearing an English crown? This question would shape the course of English and French relations for the coming centuries. Henry's inherited lands were numerous and strategic, but they were also contested. The territories of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Anjou, all vital to Henry's rule, had complex political relationships with the French king. And this would lead to ongoing tension between the English Plantagenets and the French monarchy. The power struggle between England and France would define much of the Plantagenet era, creating a series of wars, diplomatic confrontations, and territorial disputes. Early in his reign, Henry's military prowess and political savvy became apparent. He quickly turned his attention to securing his control over his vast territories, both in England and France. In 1156, Henry solidified his position by fending off a rebellion led by his brother, Geoffrey, supported by the French king, Louis VII. The rebellion, which sought to reclaim the territories in France that had been in the Plantagenet family for generations, was swiftly crushed by Henry. This victory, along with his continued support from powerful English barons, ensured that Henry's control over England remained unchallenged. Henry's influence expanded across the English Channel as he sought to further consolidate power in France. In 1159, he launched an ambitious campaign to annex the county of Toulouse, a rich and strategic region in southern France. However, this campaign proved less successful than expected, as the French king Louis VII intervened and blocked Henry's expansionist efforts. Despite this setback, Henry remained undeterred, continuing his aggressive military and diplomatic strategies to secure his position in France. While Henry's military campaigns were central to his rule, he also implemented significant reforms that would transform England's legal and administrative systems. One of the most important of these reforms was the establishment of the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. This legal reform revolutionized the English judicial system by formalizing the use of jury trials, which would become the primary means of administering justice in the kingdom. Under Henry II, the legal system was streamlined and centralized, giving the monarchy greater control over legal matters and reducing the influence of local lords and barons, who had previously exercised significant power in their own regions. In addition to his legal reforms, Henry introduced scutage, a system that allowed him to collect payments from his barons in lieu of military service. This innovation allowed Henry to raise a private army of mercenaries, reducing his reliance on the feudal system and increasing his ability to maintain control over his vast territories. These changes were critical to strengthening the monarchy's power, but they also contributed to tensions with the barons, who resented Henry's growing authority. Despite his political and military successes, Henry's reign was not without personal and familial challenges. His relationship with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a complicated one. Eleanor, who had been married to Louis VII of France before her marriage to Henry, was a powerful and ambitious woman in her own right. Their marriage, which began as a strategic alliance, later became strained as Eleanor sought to assert her own power and influence. In the 1170s, tensions between Henry and Eleanor reached a breaking point. The king's sons, who were embroiled in their own struggles for power, began to challenge Henry's authority. In 1173, Henry's eldest son, Henry the Young King, rose in rebellion against his father, seeking to claim the throne with the support of Eleanor and other discontented barons. The rebellion, known as the Revolt of the Young King, was a significant challenge to Henry's rule. The revolt was supported by the French king, Louis VII, and the Scottish king, William the Lion, who saw an opportunity to weaken England's power. Henry responded swiftly, gathering an army and suppressing the rebellion. However, the conflict took a personal toll on the king. Despite his victory, Henry's relationship with his sons became increasingly strained. Henry the Young King, who had been crowned co-king alongside his father in 1170, died in 1183. A year after his failed rebellion. The loss of his eldest son was a devastating blow to Henry, both personally and politically. In the wake of his son's death, Henry sought to secure his legacy by redistributing his lands among his remaining sons. He intended to give England and Normandy to Richard, his eldest surviving son, and Aquitaine to John, the youngest of his sons. However, Richard, a powerful and ambitious military leader, opposed this decision, believing that he should inherit Aquitaine as well. This disagreement led to further tensions within the royal family. And in 1189, Richard rose in rebellion against his father, supported by his mother, Eleanor, and his brothers. Richard the Lionheart's rebellion was the final straw in Henry's troubled reign. The conflict culminated in a series of negotiations, and in 1189, Henry II agreed to Richard's coronation as king. Henry's reign had ended in internal conflict, but his legacy was secure. The Plantagenet Dynasty, founded by Geoffrey and Matilda, would continue to rule England for centuries to come. Henry II's reign laid the foundation for the Plantagenet dynasty's dominance in both England and France. His military conquests, legal reforms, and political strategies were instrumental in shaping the course of English history. Yet, despite his successes, Henry's reign was marked by personal struggles, familial tensions, and the constant challenges of maintaining control over his vast territories. The Plantagenet Dynasty, with its complex and sometimes tragic legacy, had only just begun. Henry II's reign was marked not only by his military victories and territorial expansion, but also by significant reforms that would fundamentally change the political landscape of England. As a ruler, he recognized the need for a stronger central government and sought to consolidate his authority through legal and administrative changes. His reforms aimed to curb the influence of the barons and reduce the chaos that had ensued during the anarchy. Among his most enduring reforms was the establishment of the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. This groundbreaking legal reform revolutionized the English justice system by formally introducing the use of jury trials. These trials, designed to streamline legal proceedings, would become the cornerstone of English justice for centuries. The Assize of Clarendon not only strengthened royal control over the judicial system, but also reduced the power of feudal lords, who had previously wielded significant influence over local courts. By centralizing the justice system, Henry sought to ensure that royal authority would be paramount, especially in regions where local barons had been accustomed to operating with little oversight. This was a crucial move that would shape the future of English law. In addition to his legal reforms, Henry introduced the practice of scutage, a monetary payment in lieu of military service. This system enabled him to raise funds to hire mercenaries, thereby reducing his reliance on the feudal lords for military support. The growing centralization of power under Henry was not without its challenges. Many of the barons, who had enjoyed relative autonomy during previous reigns, resented these reforms and the increasing control exerted by the crown. While these changes brought stability to England, they also sowed the seeds of discontent among the nobility, who would later challenge Henry's authority. One of the most dramatic and consequential events of Henry's reign was his conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket had been a trusted friend and ally of Henry, serving as his chancellor before his appointment as archbishop in 1162. Henry had hoped to control the church through Becket, strengthening his influence over religious matters. However, Becket soon became an ardent defender of the church's independence and the rights of the clergy, particularly in matters of legal jurisdiction. The conflict between Henry and Becket grew as Becket increasingly resisted the king's attempts to assert control over the church. The situation reached a boiling point in 1170, when Henry, frustrated with Becket's defiance, reportedly muttered in exasperation, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" For knights, interpreting this as a command, took it upon themselves to murder Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. Becket's death was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through both England and the church. While Henry quickly sought to atone for his role in the death of the archbishop, the event severely damaged his reputation and undermined his authority. In the aftermath of Becket's murder, Henry was forced to confront the consequences of his action. He showed his remorse by walking barefoot to Becket's tomb and doing humble acts. But this incident had huge consequences. The conflict with Becket had further strained Henry's relationship with the church, which had been a powerful institution in medieval England. Though Henry managed to keep his rule intact, the murder of Becket ultimately led to growing tensions between the monarchy and the church, setting the stage for future conflicts over the balance of power between the two. As if this weren't enough, Henry was also beset by familial troubles that threatened to destabilize his reign. In 1173, his eldest son, Henry the young king, who had been crowned co-king alongside his father in 1170, rose in rebellion against him. The young king, along with his brothers and their mother Eleanor, sought to claim more power for themselves. The rebellion was backed by the French king, Louis VII, and the Scottish king, William the Lion, who saw an opportunity to weaken Henry's rule. The revolt, known as the Revolt of the Young King, was a serious challenge to Henry's authority. Henry responded swiftly, gathering an army and marching to suppress the rebellion. The conflict was fierce, but Henry's military skill ensured the defeat of the rebels. Despite the victory, the rebellion left deep scars in the family. The young king, after his failed revolt, died in 1183 at the young age of 28, just a year after his rebellion. The loss of his son was a devastating blow to Henry, both personally and politically. Henry's relationship with his surviving sons, particularly Richard and John, became increasingly strained. Richard, the Lionheart, had shown his military prowess during the rebellion and was determined to secure more power for himself. As tensions mounted between father and son, it was clear that Henry's reign was beginning to unravel. The internal conflicts within Henry's family became more pronounced as time passed. Henry's attempts to secure his legacy by dividing his lands among his sons, giving England and Normandy to Richard and Aquitaine to John, only deepened the rifts between them. Richard, a powerful and ambitious military leader, believed that he should inherit all of his father's lands, including Aquitaine. This disagreement set the stage for more rebellions and challenges to Henry's authority. In 1189, the tensions between father and son reached their peak when Richard, supported by his mother Eleanor, his brothers, and various discontented barons, rose in rebellion against Henry. This was no ordinary rebellion, was an open challenge to Henry's authority and an attempt to wrest control from him. Richard, though not yet king, had already proven himself as a capable and skilled leader, and many saw him as the natural heir to the throne. As Henry's forces struggled to suppress the rebellion, Richard was able to negotiate a deal that allowed him to be crowned king. The rebellion marked the end of Henry's reign. In 1189, after the agreement was made, Henry II reluctantly allowed Richard's coronation. However, the king was a broken man by this point. The personal betrayal by his own son, compounded by the death of his beloved son, Henry the young king, had taken a toll on his health and spirit. Less than a month after Richard's coronation, Henry II passed away on July 6, 1189, at the age of 56. The Plantagenet Dynasty now passed into the hands of Richard the Lionheart, whose reign would be marked by military campaigns and a fervent dedication to the Crusades. Henry II's death brought an end to a reign that had been full of strife and reform, while Henry was instrumental in consolidating royal power and laying the foundations for a stronger monarchy. His legacy was tainted by family strife, personal loss, and the conflict with the church. His rule had shaped the course of English history, but it was a reign that ended in the heartache of betrayal, loss, and internal division. As Richard ascended the throne, England was left in a state of uncertainty. Henry II had solidified his dynasty's position, but his struggles with his sons and the church had left scars that would take years to heal. Henry's passing marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the Plantagenet Dynasty, which would continue to dominate England for centuries. Richard's reign, characterized by his absence as he embarked on the Third Crusade, and the eventual challenges faced by his brothers, would set the stage for the dynasty's enduring struggles. Though Henry had built a powerful kingdom, it was clear that the Plantagenets' rule was far from secure, and the seeds of future conflicts were already sown. Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, was crowned King of England in 1189 following the tumultuous reign of his father, Henry II. Richard's reign would be characterized by his remarkable military prowess and determination, especially during the Third Crusade, but it would also be marked by the struggles he faced back home, particularly with his brother John, who was known as Lackland due to the absence of inherited lands. Richard the Lionheart's fame rested on his leadership during the Third Crusade, one of the most significant military campaigns of the medieval period. The Crusade, launched in 1189, aimed to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslim forces of Saladin. Richard was one of the key leaders of the Christian forces, and his courage and military expertise earned him admiration across Christendom. Despite facing numerous challenges, including political tensions with his fellow crusaders, Richard achieved significant victories, such as the capture of several key coastal cities in the Holy Land. However, the crusade proved financially draining, leaving Richard's royal treasury severely depleted. At the same time, Richard's absence from England and his prolonged absence from his kingdom allowed his brother John to cause further unrest. While Richard fought for the holy cause in the Middle East, John sought to undermine his brother's position, even conspiring with King Philip II of France to claim the English throne. This betrayal was a sharp reminder of the deep divisions within Henry II's family that had already manifested during his reign. John, always eager to seize power, had allied himself with France and set his sights on Richard's kingdom, but his treachery would ultimately be his downfall. After spending several years in the Levant, Richard returned to England in 1194, having made peace with Saladin. He immediately set about restoring his authority in his kingdom and rebuilding the English throne's influence across his territories. Richard's first order of business was to address the political challenges posed by his brother John and the rebellious barons who had supported him. With swift action, Richard defeated John's supporters and reasserted his control over the kingdom. However, Richard's reign was cut short by a tragic accident. In 1199, during a military campaign in France, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt while laying siege to the castle of Châlons-Chabrol. Though the wound initially seemed minor, Richard's condition worsened rapidly, and he succumbed to his injuries shortly thereafter. His death marked the end of an era for the Plantagenet Dynasty, as Richard was widely mourned for his bravery and his role as a crusading hero. Despite Richard's legacy, his untimely death left England in a precarious situation. Richard had no legitimate heirs, and his death brought to light the unresolved tensions within the royal family, particularly with his younger brother, John. John, who had never been fully accepted by the English nobility due to his earlier actions, was now poised to take the throne. However, John's accession to the throne was not greeted with the same respect or enthusiasm that Richard had enjoyed. His rule would be marred by disputes over territories in France, failed military campaigns, and mounting dissatisfaction from the barons and common people alike. The stage was set for the Plantagenet Dynasty's continued struggles. John's reign, which began in 1199, would soon be marked by a series of political missteps and military failures. His inability to recover the lands in France that Richard had fought for would set the stage for the further erosion of England's power on the continent. Additionally, John's harsh rule and increasing taxation would drive the barons to the brink of rebellion, setting in motion the events that would lead to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. John's reign, which began with such promise, quickly descended into a nightmare of rebellion, taxation, and lost territories. John, often seen as a weak and ineffectual king, alienated the very people he needed to secure his reign. His inability to hold on to the lands that his father and brother had won in France, coupled with his harsh treatment of his barons, led to widespread unrest. The barons, frustrated with John's rule, eventually forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that would limit the power of the monarchy and lay the groundwork for future constitutional developments in England. John's reign was marked by his failure to reclaim the lost territories of Normandy, which had been a source of immense power for the Plantagenet dynasty. In 1204, John lost Normandy to King Philip II of France, and despite numerous attempts to recover the region, John's efforts were unsuccessful. This loss was not just a military defeat, it was a symbol of England's waning influence in Europe, and it would have long-lasting consequences for the Plantagenet family. The loss of Normandy, in particular, meant that England was no longer able to project its power into France in the same way it had under Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. The political fallout from John's failure to recover Normandy, coupled with his inability to win the support of the barons, culminated in the signing of the Magna Carta. This historic document, forced upon John by his barons, set forth principles that would limit the king's power and establish certain rights for the nobility and the church. Though John would later attempt to annul the document, the Magna Carta became a symbol of the growing influence of Parliament and the gradual shift toward constitutional monarchy in England. After John's death in 1216, the crown passed to his young son, Henry III, who was only 9 years old at the time. Henry III's reign, which lasted for over 50 years, would see significant changes in the English monarchy and the Plantagenet dynasty. Unlike his father, Henry was not a military leader, and much of his reign was characterized by political intrigue and negotiations with the barons. Despite his initial inexperience, Henry's rule eventually stabilized, and he was able to assert royal authority, although not without constant tension with the nobility. Henry's reign saw the rise of Parliament as a powerful institution, as he was forced to work with the barons and the church to secure his rule. In 1258, during a period of conflict with his barons, Henry agreed to a series of reforms that would shape the future of English governance. These reforms, known as the Provisions of Oxford, established the first official council of barons, effectively giving the nobility a say in the running of the kingdom. This was a significant step toward the development of parliamentary democracy in England. Henry's son Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks, would go on to become one of the most famous kings of the Plantagenet Dynasty. Edward's reign, which began in 1272, was marked by his military conquests, particularly his campaigns in Wales and Scotland. In 1282, Edward succeeded in bringing Wales under English control, and he created the title Prince of Wales for his son, symbolizing the complete subjugation of the Welsh people. Edward's military campaigns in Scotland, however, were less successful. Despite his early victories, the Scots, led by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, mounted a fierce resistance to English rule. Edward's reign saw the beginning of the Wars of Scottish Independence, which would last for several decades and ultimately lead to Scotland's independence from England. Despite these challenges, Edward I's reign is often seen as a high point in the Plantagenet dynasty's rule. His legal reforms, including the establishment of the Model Parliament in 1295, laid the groundwork for the English political system. Edward's reign, like that of his ancestors, was marked by both military successes and political strife, but it also represented the consolidation of royal power in England. By the end of the 13th century, the Plantagenets had solidified their control over England, although their hold on the French territories had slipped further away. The dynasty, having endured internal conflict, rebellion, and war, was now poised for further challenges. The legacy of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and Edward I would continue to shape English history for centuries. But the century-long struggle for supremacy in France would eventually culminate in the 100 Years' War, a defining chapter in the history of the Plantagenet dynasty. Edward I's death in 1307 marked a turning point for the Plantagenet dynasty. His son, Edward II, ascended to the throne, but his reign would prove to be fraught with challenges. Edward II was not cut from the same cloth as his father. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his towering stature and military prowess, had been a formidable king, consolidating England's power through military conquest and strategic alliances. In contrast, Edward II struggled with both personal and political issues that would lead to his eventual downfall. Edward II's early reign was overshadowed by his reliance on favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom Edward showered with lands and titles. This favoritism angered the English nobility, who resented Gaveston's rise and his perceived undue influence over the king. The barons, already wary of Edward's weak leadership, were further alienated by his blatant disregard for their authority. The relationship between Edward and the barons quickly deteriorated, and in 1312, they exiled Gaveston, accusing him of corrupting the king's judgment. Gaveston's exile did not bring peace to the kingdom. Edward's continued favoritism towards others, such as Hugh Despenser the Younger, further alienated his barons. Despenser's influence over the king grew to a point where he was perceived as a second Gaveston, and the barons began to view him as a threat to their own power. In 1321, this discontent culminated in the Despencer War, a rebellion led by a coalition of barons who sought to remove Hugh Despencer from the king's favor. Edward was forced to make concessions, including the banishment of Despencer, but this temporary peace was short-lived. As the years wore on, Edward II's failure to address the growing unrest within his kingdom became more evident. The situation was exacerbated by the ongoing conflict with Scotland. Edward I had launched a series of campaigns to subdue the Scots. But after his death, his son Edward II failed to maintain the same level of control over Scotland. In 1314, despite having an army nearly twice the size of the Scottish forces, Edward II suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn. Led by Robert the Bruce, the Scots secured a decisive victory, effectively ending English control over Scotland for the time being. The defeat at Bannockburn was a devastating blow to Edward II's reign. Not only had he lost control of Scotland, but the defeat also exposed his weakness as a military leader. This loss of prestige, coupled with his ongoing conflicts with the barons, plunged Edward into a deeper crisis. Barons, already dissatisfied with his rule, saw the loss of Scotland as a symbol of his incompetence. They began to question whether Edward II was fit to rule, and the growing unrest in England began to spill over into more open rebellion. In 1325, Edward's wife, Isabella of France, became increasingly dissatisfied with her husband's rule. Isabella, who had initially been a politically motivated marriage to Edward, had grown disillusioned by his failure to address her concerns and the ongoing turbulence in the kingdom. At the same time, Isabella formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a baron who had been exiled for his role in the Despencer War. Mortimer's influence over Isabella grew, and together they plotted to overthrow Edward. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army in France and invaded England. Edward, already weakened by internal strife and the loss of support from his nobles, was unable to mount an effective defense. Edward's forces were quickly overwhelmed, and in a dramatic turn of events, Edward was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son, Edward III. The coup marked the end of Edward II's reign and the beginning of a new era for the Plantagenets. Edward II was imprisoned, and his fate became the subject of speculation and controversy. While some sources suggest he was murdered in captivity, others argue that he died of natural causes. Regardless of the circumstances of his death, Edward II's reign left a lasting stain on the Plantagenet dynasty. His weakness and inability to govern effectively had exposed the vulnerabilities of the dynasty. And his failure to recover Scotland was a blow to England's status as a European power. Edward III, his young son, inherited the throne at the age of 14. Despite his youth, Edward III quickly proved himself to be a capable and ambitious ruler. Determined to restore the reputation of the Plantagenet dynasty, he sought to reassert England's influence over Scotland and France, both of which had slipped out of English control during his father's reign. Edward III's reign would see the Plantagenets return to military prominence, particularly through the start of the 100 Years' War with France. but the legacy of Edward II's failure would linger over the dynasty for years to come. The decline of Edward II's reign and the rise of Edward III marked a turning point in the history of the Plantagenet Dynasty. Edward's inability to maintain control over Scotland and his disastrous military leadership had weakened the dynasty's authority, and the internal conflicts within England threatened the stability of the monarchy. However, the emergence of Edward III brought a new sense of hope and ambition to the Plantagenets. Edward III's determination to reclaim England's lost territories would ignite a new era of warfare and territorial expansion that would define the Plantagenet dynasty for the coming centuries. Edward III's reign, marked by his early victories in the 100 Years' War, stood as a testament to the power and ambition of the Plantagenet dynasty. The war, which began in 1337, had its roots in a territorial dispute between England and France. Edward III, claiming the French throne through his mother, Isabella of France, sought to assert his rights over the French crown. The French, however, rejected his claim, and thus began a conflict that would last for over a century, shifting the power dynamics of Europe. Edward's early victories, particularly at the Battle of Aix-en-Saint-By-sur-Loire, demonstrated the superiority of the English military, especially their longbowmen. The English won significant victories, capturing key French territories, including Calais, which would remain under English control for over 200 years. Another major victory came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English captured the French king, John II, a humiliating blow to the French crown. Despite these successes, the war soon began to shift in favor of the French. The English, although victorious in key battles, struggled to maintain control over the vast territories they had claimed. The French, led by figures like Charles V, began to turn the tide. Charles's military genius and strategic alliances allowed the French to reclaim much of the territory lost to the English. By the time Edward III died in 1377, most of the French territories once held by the English had been lost, marking a significant decline in the Plantagenet dynasty's power. The prolonged nature of the war and the drain it placed on both England and France also had deep political consequences. The Plantagenets, despite their early successes, found it increasingly difficult to manage their vast holdings and maintain control over their territories. The war was financially exhausting, and the English people, burdened by taxes and the constant threat of invasion, began to grow weary. Internal divisions, particularly between the nobility and the crown, added to the instability. This internal strife would later manifest in the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that would see the Plantagenet dynasty turn on itself. Edward III's later years were marked by the instability of his rule, with his ability to govern effectively diminishing. His sons, particularly the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, had proven their military prowess. But the Black Prince's premature death in 1376 left Edward III's legacy in doubt. Edward's direct descendants did not have the same military success, and as his health declined, the crown was left in the hands of his weak grandson, Richard II, who would inherit a fractured kingdom. The decline of the Plantagenets during the 100 Years' War demonstrated that even the mightiest dynasties are susceptible to the pressures of war, financial strain, and internal conflict. While Edward III's reign had initially been marked by glory, the prolonged warfare and eventual loss of French territories set the stage for the dynasty's decline. The end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453, which left the English with little more than Calais, signaled the end of the Plantagenet Dynasty's power in France. As the Hundred Years' War concluded, the Plantagenet Dynasty found itself at a crossroads. The decades-long conflict with France had drained the English crown's resources and left the kingdom weakened. In the aftermath of the war, internal strife, political infighting, and factionalism plagued the royal family. The most devastating of these conflicts was the Wars of the Roses, a series of bloody civil wars that would last from 1455 to 1487, ultimately ending the Plantagenet dynasty's rule over England. The Wars of the Roses were a direct result of the instability that followed the Hundred Years' War. The Plantagenets had split into two competing factions, the Lancasters and the Yorks, both of whom claimed legitimate rights to the throne. The Lancastrians, led by Henry VI, were descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son, while the Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, traced their lineage to the second son of Edward III. These rival factions, both with royal bloodlines, fought for control of the throne, and the wars became a devastating struggle for dominance. Henry VI's reign had been marked by weakness and mental instability, leading to a breakdown in central authority. As Henry's condition deteriorated, the Yorkists saw an opportunity to claim the throne. And Richard, Duke of York, assumed the role of protector of the realm. The battle for the crown intensified as both sides fought for control of the monarchy. In 1460, Richard was killed in battle, but his son, Edward IV, continued the fight. Edward IV eventually emerged victorious, defeating the Lancastrians at the Battle of Totton in 1461 and claiming the throne. Edward IV's reign was marked by attempts to strengthen his rule and consolidate power. Despite his successes on the battlefield, he faced constant threats from the Lancastrian faction, particularly from Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, who continued to lead Lancastrian forces in a bid to restore her son to the throne. However, Edward IV's victories were short-lived. In 1470, after a series of political alliances and betrayals, the Lancastrians briefly regained the throne, with Henry VI being restored to power. But this resurgence was short-lived, and in 1471, Edward IV defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury, effectively ending their claim to the throne. Edward IV's victory solidified his position, but the constant warfare had taken its toll on the country and the royal family. The division within the Plantagenet family was not over, and the Yorkist monarchy faced continued internal challenges. Edward IV's death in 1483 led to another struggle for power. As his young son, Edward V, ascended the throne. However, the boy king was soon imprisoned by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who declared himself Richard III. Richard III's reign would prove to be short and controversial, as he faced mounting opposition from those who saw his rise as illegitimate. The final blow to the Plantagenet dynasty came in 1485, when Richard III was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor. A distant relative of the Lancastrians, Henry Tudor, claimed the throne as Henry VII, marking the end of the Plantagenet Dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Richard III's death in battle and Henry VII's subsequent coronation signaled the end of a chapter in English history that had been defined by centuries of Plantagenet rule. The end of the Plantagenets was a dramatic and violent conclusion to a dynasty that had shaped England for over 300 years. The Wars of the Roses had torn the kingdom apart, and the Plantagenet family, which had once been one of the most powerful and influential dynasties in Europe, was left in ruins. The Tudors, with their more centralized and stable rule, would bring a new era of English governance. However, the legacy of the Plantagenets would endure in the hearts and minds of the English people, who would continue to remember the dynasty's triumphs, tragedies, and the wars that ultimately led to its fall. The Plantagenet dynasty had transformed England from a peripheral kingdom into one of the most powerful states in Europe. But their legacy was also one of internal strife, bloody wars, and contested claims to the throne. The fall of the Plantagenets and the rise of the Tudors marked the end of an era in English history. But the echoes of the Plantagenet reign would continue to resonate through the centuries.